It reminds me of the kind of classic trope in like bad work environments, where the manager comes in and says, I'm going to need this done by the end of day. And the person's like, that's literally like, I can't, that's impossible. And they say, just find a way. And they walk off, like that's what it,
that's called good management.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 412 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artiste.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today is April 21st, 20 Jubilee. And before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. And we'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net, although you can get there through podcast.bscotch.net. Basically, just go to bscotch.net, and then somehow we'll get your money.
All roads.
Don't even worry about it.
Yeah, all roads lead to your money in our pockets. It's just a good deal.
Yeah, that's just business.
Ideally.
Okay. Now, what we're going to do today is question apocalypse. Okay.
And you might think that means answering just an enormous number of questions, but you would be wrong. Probably one question, two tops.
Mm-hmm. But we will answer those few questions enormously.
Yeah, exactly.
So don't even worry about it.
Get it part.
So these questions come from our listeners at podcast.bscotch.net. And if you'd like to get your question onto a future episode, you can go there, ask, and people can upvote them. So we try to, go down the list. Highest upvoted first. So ask good ones, and maybe we'll do it. Highest upvoted question comes from JohnFlavin, who says, Sam mentioned on episode 409 that he had met with a life coach for about a year. I've considered doing that as well and wanted to hear more about his motivation for having done that. Why did he start and why did he stop?
That's good. I think about what a life coach does as sort of looking the opposite direction that a therapist looks. So therapists typically you go talk to because you're like, I got some shit that I know I need to deal with in my past, like, hey, here's
your therapist is like, how does that make you feel?
Yeah. And
you're
like, tell me about your mother. And you're like, yeah, okay. So, and then the life coach is more oriented on like the future and goal oriented part of stuff. So it's just like, it's basically a therapist for your future is the way I think about it. Though of course, going to therapy is very good for your future also. So,
yeah,
just facts.
They're just different lenses of sort of like figuring your shit out.
Yeah, exactly. Different approaches. So the reason I started going was because this is around when I was, I think, 28 or 29. And I'd mentioned, I think in one of the previous episodes, talking about art stuff, about this period of time I went into kind of a bit of mix of burnout, being tired of people, being tired of sucking at art, or it just being hard, if that makes sense. Like just, I could generate it, but it always felt very challenging to do. And it felt like, when I was sitting in a room full of programmers, since I was the only art person on the team, that, I'd see them find these additional tools, be able to write these scripts to automate parts of their work. And then I was over here just line by line struggling, sort of a vibe.
Yeah. Every new piece of art is just as hard as the last one, if not harder.
Yeah. And so I was getting a little frustrated with that kind of, sitting in that particular space, and then had that recurring feeling of is this all there is?
Which, you had like a quarter life crisis kind of thing where you're like,
yeah.
Also, you kind of hit these points where if you've been doing something for a long time, and then you kind of cast forward and you're like,
exactly.
5 years from now, 10 years from now, is this shit going to be just exactly the same? Mm-hmm. And is that going to be true for 20 years or 30 years?
Yes.
It's kind of demotivating.
Yeah. And so I think the problem is if you get in that particular mode, it's hard. I wouldn't call it like a depressive state, but it's hard to adopt a different kind of a lens, to kind of dig yourself out of that viewpoint. Because essentially what I realized through, working with this guy was just that it was just a dumb question, frankly. You can orient your life around certain questions, right? And the question I had at the time was, is this all there is? Which is just one of the dumbest questions I think you could actually be fixated on.
We're all taught that it's like a, important, meaningful, deep, smart question, right? Because it's it's a trope that you just see your whole life, right? Is this
but also, I think it's important
meaning and all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's important to recognize where that feeling comes from, which is that for the entire first chunk of your life until you're probably like 25 or so, there is a milestone.
Yes.
Right.
There's a next new thing coming.
Yeah. Like you're going to the next grade or the next semester. And like there's big chunks of time. Where it's like, oh, there'll be like a summer break or like you're starting the new year or, oh, you can drive now. You got your license. You're 21. You can drink or whatever. Like there's all these benchmarks in the future where you're like, oh, yeah, once that happens, something's going to be different.
Right.
Right. And once you get into your mid-20s, those benchmarks literally just completely stop coming.
Yes.
There's no like sudden thing that'll happen later. Which is where it's like you start casting forward and you're like, wow, like I guess this is it.
Yeah. I do.
We're done now.
Yep. I do this work thing every day. It kind of looks the same. And, I can't get these kind of automation gains that I see my peers getting basically on the programming side. So like, I guess scrolling on a tablet is sort of the rest of my life now sort of a thing. So that's essentially the question I came to him with to start with. I said, hey, here's where I'm at. I'm just stuck in this particular feeling and I need some assistance processing it and basically creating a different frame going forward. Like I knew what the problem was. I couldn't figure out how to escape it. Right. And then through, I think I did it for like 6 to 12 months or so, differing frequencies over the time, every 2 weeks, sometimes every 4 weeks, whatever. Just these hour-long chats where it would be, he essentially just provides some kind of challenge for me to go do, big or small, that was kind of in line with essentially just slowly dismantling that weird lens that I had gotten kind of stuck in. So again, it's essentially therapy. It's just you call it something else, I guess, to make it not therapy.
I really like the term that people use for this kind of mode is being stuck in a rut.
Yes,
which I really like because that where that visual comes from is like old like dirt roads and stuff where you'd have like wagons that would go down the same path and they would kind of wear these like trenches and these ruts into the road. And at a certain point, like if you're going down this road and your like the ruts get too deep because the path has been traveled so many times that at some point you can no longer turn the wheels and go somewhere else because you're just like deep in this groove, right? And I think that is something that happens to people. Like you kind of build these ruts in your brain, like you strengthen all these neural pathways for habits and routines and stuff. And you got at this point where you realize like every day is kind of the same, but also you can't seem to fathom doing literally anything differently.
Yep.
And you want things to be different, but
there's like a big
the routine
cloud.
is it just seems impossible.
I mean, I think it's part of the core curse of being a person, which is the hedonic treadmill, right?
Yes.
Which is that no matter what's going on, if things stop changing or even continue changing, but only in the same way, right? Either way, your brain is just after a while, it's just like, but I've seen this before. I no longer care. Now I'm depressed, right? And it's kind of a
you crave novelty all the time.
Yeah, it's kind of a bizarre curse in many ways, especially because of how we've set up society too, right? Where it's like when you're growing up and young, we're trying to get you ready to be in the world, right? At least in theory. And
it's important for you to learn all these different
so you're
things,
just like confronted constantly by new stuff and you're moving through it, right? But the sort of the indicator of success that you've made it, right, is when everything is fine now and nothing is changing, right? Like you're now like through like the first part of getting a job and now you've got a stable income, you got a stable home situation, like everything becomes stable, right? And stable means unchanging, right? That was something I had to fight with too, is I could feel the conflict happening to me a few years into working with the studio, where I knew that like this is what I wanted. Like I was able to have the life that I wanted to have, that nobody was putting external pressure on me, right? And I was really content and satisfied with like the life that I had. But I could also feel my brain chafing against the sort of
security. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I guess the weird thing is like the reality is you're all driving toward a point where you've arrived, where you're secure, or whatever else. But I think you have to recognize that being only secure is not completely healthy either. Like essentially being static, right? You can become very stagnant. Or it feels very stagnant.
You can't grow if nothing changes because you don't experience any new ideas or things to synthesize into your mindset.
Yes. So basically where I came out of, I'll give an example of like one of what I think is a silly thing that I did during that time. As one of those like little challenges, which is I was just working on, like I have a pretty intense codependent streak in me, which is to say that I don't mean that people use that word negatively, but I'm just describing sort of what it is like to be me, which is the outside world and other people's feelings, just sort of, they kind of just permeate in really easily. And so I then naturally want to make sure that everybody else is doing okay. And it is basically becomes very emotionally important for me to make sure that someone else is emotionally well, right?
Right. Because if you pick up on that somebody is distraught, then you are instantly distraught as well.
Exactly.
And you're like, I have to make this person not feel that way so I can stop feeling that way.
So while I worked on, that particular thing.
That's good. Like it sucks that you have like that permeates through so easily, but also like it's good that you kind of have this internal compulsion to help people, whether you want to or not.
I mean, it's very useful in social settings and stuff. It's the reason why I enjoy schmoozing and I'm good at it, because I can just detect what's going on with people. But the place where it got very frustrating is, if you have, say, something that you want to do, some way you want to assert yourself that could make someone else uncomfortable. And in my mind, that is even just like violating the script. So in my case, really, really simple example of this, and one of the ways that I challenged it was I had always wanted to do that thing where you go to like a drive-through and you buy your stuff and then you buy the stuff for the person behind you. Now, this sounds like that should be like, why are you even thinking about it? It sounds like just a nice thing to do, right? However, it's a script change for the cashier. Like you have to essentially say, hey, don't do what you normally do. Do this other thing instead. And they got to be like, what? Yeah. And then of course you also have the case where like someone at some point is going to be like, I'm not going to pay for the person behind me because I don't know what the fuck they got. So you basically have to be okay with those facts, right? And so I would go I would drive through, there's like a Starbucks near me. And so the challenge was for this month was like, go there and do that thing, do it. And I would just go buy like a latte or some shit, and then the first time I went to go do it, I literally couldn't. I got to the window and I couldn't do it, which sounds insane because like I've given talks at GDC at this point. Like I can, it's not that I'm anxious about.
Yeah, but of course, like giving a talk at GDC, like that's part of the plan.
Exactly.
Your people need to give talks that you applied, you were chosen. There's a process. There's a path.
Yes.
You're not violating anybody's expectations by just doing exactly what you were supposed to do.
And so like asserting yourself basically was the challenge I had. And so slowly it literally took, I think it was like 3 trips over a couple of days before I actually did it, and then it was like such a high that I would like occasionally sort of, return it and do this thing again. And it's weird because it's like a small dumb example of this, but it was a way to kind of crack into it. And so that's again what this guy kind of offered was a few of these ways to kind of like find these little behaviors that you set in where you are calcifying yourself and just like get a little hammer, just kind of like tap the thing. So after basically a year and some change, then I kind of felt like I was through with it because I no longer was fixated on that particular question. And a big part of that is where I basically managed to we were talking about burnout a few episodes ago. I managed to step my vision for myself upward a bit in terms of layers of abstraction. So that's when I started diving very intensely into what it meant to be like a game, either a game producer or a game director, depending on how you want to call them. Researching all sorts of stuff.
This was also kind of around the time that you started taking art classes and
yes. Yep.
Stuff like
it
that.
all kind of came as
something. Yeah, and something that I think you had kind of gotten into the mindset of was a pretty strong like self-handicapping mode when it came to the art where you were like, I'm always just going to use a mouse. I'm just going to use the same piece of software. I'm not going to like go make art for the sake of learning more art. I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to do it as needed, like a just-in-time art delivery service for our games. And there was a long time where even like after Crashlands came out, where you still wouldn't refer to yourself as an artist, right?
Yeah, it took a while.
And so all that stuff is kind of a way to kind of like absolve yourself of fully committing to it and also giving yourself kind of a fallback excuse. If you do happen to make something that you don't think looks very good, you could be like, well, that's just, I'm not an artist. Like I'm just some guy who happens to make art for this.
Yeah. I mean, it was very much, it's choosing the kind of warm but stagnant living of being secure instead of a bit more of that on the edge growth mindset sort of stuff, right?
Yeah, because if you're not an artist, then everything you make is way beyond expectations.
Exactly.
But if you are an artist, then you have to start to have standards and a much more critical eye, and you have to think like, would an artist have made this thing? And it changes your perspective. But you didn't really start to take on that mantle.
No, it was through this process,
talking to this life coach and stuff like that. Yeah. Because it's you got to get uncomfortable to grow.
Yep.
And that also means looking at like reframing how you're looking at your own experiences, your own expectations, and how you're thinking about your skills and all of that. And a lot of that is kind of ego bruising sometimes.
Oh, 100%. I think it has to be.
But you have to recognize, and I also kind of feel this way. Like there have been times where I've talked to people who say like, oh yeah, like I want to like get into lifting or something, and I'll go to the gym with them. And they can't help, and I'll be like teaching them how to go through the machines and stuff like that. And they can't help but look at how much weight other people are doing on the same exercises, right? And it's like you don't see where they started. And it's really easy to look at exactly where you are and just be like, wow, like this is bad, right? Even just by the numbers, like, well, I'm at like half of what these other people are doing. But as soon as you start judging yourself that way, as opposed to just being proud of taking the time to work through the process, then you're just going to keep bruising your own ego when really just doesn't
ideally
matter.
you see, and we talked about this in the past too, right? In other sort of question context, but the more you can frame your own sort of status along any dimension as just relative to your own status and where it was previously, right?
Yeah,
and
it's
use
about growth,
other people not even as benchmarks, but just as examples of possible outcomes, right?
Or even just examples of alternative processes you can use.
That's
I think they're similar, right? Yeah, it's basically seeing like, oh, this is cool. Like basically serving humanity as a source of inspiration, not a source of metrics by which to find yourself lacking, right?
Yeah,
so that you can then go to the gym and see like some enormous, huge, jacked person, right, and be like, oh, like there might be a way, there might be a path for me to get from where I am to there, right? And that may or may not be true because body types differ, right? And then you get
usage of drugs.
You get to ask the question, right? But then you get to ask the question, which is the cool thing, right? You get to ask yourself, like, do I want that? Can I? Is that even possible because of my circumstance, right? And so, do I want it? Is it possible? And then, how would I do that? And then you can try to if you want to, but you also have the option. I think this is the part that people fall flat on, is of looking at that and being like,
I don't want that.
I love the idea of that outcome, but I really don't want to do the stuff that gets me there, right? Which is where that's where I am for like I've become very comfortable just like taking that position on tons of stuff because there is the stuff that I really want to be good at, and that's what I put my time into, and I just have to recognize that I have finite time. It's just a fact. I've got finite time.
Can't do everything.
No, and so if I focus like all the time I want to into the stuff I really care about, I just can't also put focus into other stuff that I don't care about as much, right?
And there's things that you can want, right? I think that's the thing. Is like you can look at.
Yeah, you can want it.
You could be like, it would be nice if I was super jacked, But do you actually?
We'd all love to have a six pack.
Yeah, but
like,
do you actually enjoy the process?
Am I going to do that?
Or can you figure out how to? I think that's what we talked about previously. Can you figure out how to enjoy the process? And that was a big piece of it for me. Is like realizing that I think through the gateway of some of that art education that I did online. During this time too, then I both got words to talk about stuff that I've been doing for a long time. I was able to actually scrutinize my own work instead of just having either myself or other people be like, it doesn't look very good. And then being like, I don't know what to do about that because I can't talk about it, can't figure it out.
That's is what it is. I don't even know how I got there.
And then the big one for me was realizing that, so people talk a lot about art style, and this word style comes up just all the damn time when you're looking at trying to get better as an artist. People are trying to trying to find my style. And it was this realization for me that came from some of the classes, as well as just a bunch of these YouTube, art videos I was watching, that style is not a thing you can do. It's the end result of a particular process for solving problems visually. That's it. So if you follow a process, you will get a particular kind of an output. And it was this weird thing where I was like, oh, that means that in order to grow your own style, what you actually need to do is basically refine and expand your process in a way that gets you closer to whatever it is that visual target is that you want, right? So I started then looking at, Photoshop documents provided by some animators and stuff like that had artwork there. We like to see just like, how are they constructing things? What's their layer? Like what layers are they using? I have all these layers in digital art and stuff. And then started doing experiments with those to see like, okay, what happens if I do something kind of similar to that, borrow this idea of how you color shadows or how you handle flats in your paintings, whatever else. And then out of that, then things started kind of coming together where it basically was taking this idea, a thing that seemed like a very lofty thing that you're always trying to get at, but you don't have any mechanism by which to do it. You don't actually understand what you're trying to do. And then basically blowing it up and saying, and actually describing what it really is, which is not the big fancy output, but the result of a billion tiny inputs that you can actually study and change. And that kind of, that was just a big, I think, moment for me in that whole process of trying to get out of that rut and recognizing that like, oh, okay, things only look stagnant because I'm dumb. Does that make sense? Like, I'm so dumb that I don't understand what it is I'm flailing up against. And instead of asking a question, instead of pausing and asking a question, what am I flailing up against? I've just been asking a different question, which is like, why is this flailing getting me nowhere? And it's, again, dumb question, the wrong question.
But you also I feel like you did on some level know, because you did talk a lot about process early on.
I did, but I didn't, it's basically that Dunning-Kruger problem.
Right. Like you thought that you had thought a lot about your process.
Yes.
But just because you were like, processes are important.
Yes.
And you recognize that, but then you kind of didn't go far enough into it. Kind of a thing.
It's more like I was focused on the technical process, like the minutia of the execution, hotkeys. Like how to do things fast, and it is part of style. Actually, it does end up coming out in the style in certain ways. But I wasn't recognizing the tie between other higher level elements in terms of how you're organizing your thought process or whatever else, and the result in terms of the style that comes out.
Right.
But yeah, so I think that's just finding a way to pivot to a better question is, I think, the key. And unfortunately, a big part of that is realizing that you're asking the wrong question, which you could spend a very long time asking the same question over and over again.
Well, it's changing the focus from like you may have a goal in mind, right? But it's changing the focus from the goal itself to just the process, right? It's one of the things that I like to try to constantly reframe for myself as well, right? It's just that simple idea that if that every outcome is just, as you said, a result of the process that you took to get there, right? Mm-hmm. And if you focus then on making the process and making the work good and satisfying and the kind of thing that leads to that outcome, right?
Yes.
Then the outcome becomes a side effect that you don't have to pay attention to anymore, right? And so I think about that for the studio, where the studio's job is to become the kind of team that is able to make games that can be successfully sold and win awards and that kind of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So the goal of the studio isn't to make games and sell them. It's to be able to, right? And then if we can, then of course we will, right? That's just a side effect of that fact. And so
if we can't, then, that's a problem.
then it definitely won't happen, right? So
it was actually, the way that you're talking about this, something I would think about a lot is the idea of like zooming out into further and further layers of abstraction. Because one of the things that I spent a lot of time talking with my wife about in her former company that she was at is they always talked about their revenue goals. Just all day, every day, it was like, we need to make this much money this year. This is our revenue target. This is our revenue target. And every conversation just revolved around revenue, which is even further like downstream in terms of outcomes, right? Because it's like, okay, as a company, you have processes that you're going to do. Those processes enable you to create a product or deliver a service, right? And then you also need to figure out how to sell that service, and then the revenue comes in, right? And so it's like two layers away from what you're actually doing is the revenue. You don't get to just be like,
you don't get to
our goal is to generate revenue, and then you just generate revenue. Like that's not a verb that you do. It's like a multi-layered.
It reminds me of the kind of classic trope in like bad work environments, where the manager comes in and says, I'm going to need this done by the end of day. And the person's like, that's literally like, I can't, that's impossible. And they say, just find a way. And they walk off, like that's what it,
That's called good management.
that's what it feels like. The way it's like
Inspiring.
yeah, is you just take some goal that basically is disconnected from reality, and then you just say, I don't know, make it happen, right? Like that's what this revenue target thing is, right? Like you don't talk about how or why like that goal is, and it's so disconnected from the reality of actually doing the work. But you just say like, go figure it out. I guess I don't know.
To the point about going to the gym, I think a very physical and obvious sort of version of this, like it's going to the gym and seeing that person who's very very jacked and being like, we're gonna get there, and then that's the end of the process.
And you're not really looking at like what exercises you're doing or how often you're going. You just keep looking at this jacked person and being like, why am I not there?
Yeah. Or what kind of body type you have. Does it even make sense?
Yeah. Is this person like a 7 foot tall Viking jacked up on steroids, And
so on the game side, then you see the same thing, which is if you just say like, we're gonna make an award-winning game. It's like that's the aspirational target, which you can unwind stuff out. You can unwind questions out of. But if you just sort of like leave it there and then again continue doing whatever you've been doing, it's not going to happen. Same thing with art. I want to make illustrations like they're this good, like get trending on ArtStation, that like blow up on Twitter or whatever the fuck. You don't get to do that. You can use that as an aspirational target.
That's a hope.
Yeah, that's a hope. But you use that as a target.
And it's a side effect of what you actually do, which is
exactly.
Yeah, which is the work process.
The art. Yeah, or whatever. Yeah. Let's go to the next question, which comes from Teele, who says, Butterscotchigans. You were one of the initial inspirations for me to dive into productivity and personal growth literature. Ooh. After trying a lot of things and failing at them, nice, I was discouraged until I realized, like you lads, I have ADHD. How have your methods for
such a classic pathway too? Yeah. You start digging into self-help, like how do I help myself? What's going on? And then in the end, it turns out, my brain just works different than how the world was designed.
So the question is, how have your methods for deep work and or fast work changed post-diagnosis, and how does medication factor in? So I have some thoughts about this, which is that when I first got my diagnosis and medication, especially in that first month, the medication works so fucking well.
Yeah.
At one point I went back and looked at my Git commit history, and you could tell.
Something happened.
The moment I started taking Ritalin, it was like 3 times the number of commits. I was refactoring shit that had been bothering me for years. I was doing stuff on week. I was just going. It was like suddenly this weight was lifted off and I could like really focus on the things that I wanted to do. And also I could choose to ignore the things that I didn't want to do, right? But over time, something happened, which is that I got cocky. So I was taking the meds and I'm like, oh yeah, all my I don't have to worry about all this shit anymore. I don't have to worry about like all these systems I used to use to keep myself on target. Even stuff like, I was really focused on exercise and stuff like that because, you gotta take care of your body to take care of your mind. There were all these things that I had built in my life to keep me on track. And I came to believe pretty quickly that I don't have to worry about that shit anymore. I got these drugs, right? Mm-hmm. But the drug's efficacy is not constant. Yeah, it declines.
It's also not curative, right? Like it makes it easier to manage your ADHD, but it doesn't you still have ADHD. You still have symptoms. Your brain still works that way, right? It just makes it easier to deal with.
Yeah. And so what I kind of found was that actually because up until that point, I had done a pretty good job of paying really close attention to my routines and my systems and my to-do lists and my wellness and all that. Then once I added the drugs in, then it was like I was super powered, right? Mm-hmm. But then over the next 6 months, the only thing that I had going for me was the drugs because everything else just totally fell off, right? And at that point, I was actually doing far worse than I was before I had the drugs. So it's kind of a learning process of realizing like I shouldn't be. There is no silver bullet. There is no like just do this thing and now you're good to go. It's a continuous refinement and process, and also like your systems and the ways that you're managing your work and all that stuff. It's never a solved problem. It's always in response to a bunch of other things that you're working on, and you have to constantly check in with it.
Yeah. Just because I think it's important to have like multiple examples, especially people who want to seek treatment maybe, but are worried about what the outcomes look like, right? For me, it was actually kind of the opposite, which my normal like habits and maintenance systems and so on, like mostly it just depends on the fact that I get to trust that the stuff that I'm interested in and can focus on is useful enough, right? That I can just let my brain do it at once. Like that's how I get around in the world, right? Because
you coast on your brain, on the winds of your brain.
yeah, because all systems management like just drives me. I don't like I can't pay attention to the system management, right? So I rely on not having to have systems by focusing on programming, automating things so I don't have to do them ever again, and then focusing just on what I'm interested in. And when I started on Adderall, I was actually able to do more stuff to manage the rest of my life. I was actually able, because I got above that threshold where I could do a better job of tracking what I was even supposed to be doing in the first place, of doing things that I didn't want to do, right?
It let you stop focusing on the moment-to-moment doing and zoom out and
like do some other kinds of stuff that normally I just wouldn't. And so, so I mean, you can have like any of these kinds of. Every single person's situation with these things is just completely fucking unique, right?
Yeah, I think my first year or so afterwards felt like a kind of a weird magical time because it was synced with the pandemic, and so going from my time got very big. I felt like I just suddenly had shitloads of time where previously
your days were just very long.
Yeah, because it's like previously even with the commute and whatever else, even going to I didn't go to the gym for a year. I just went for runs and stuff, which are 20 minutes here and there. There was, I think, an ability to actually fucking relax that I had never experienced, which is weird to say because it's like, oh yeah, I'm on a bunch of stimulants, I can finally relax.
You have ADHD when you take your Adderall and then go take a nap. Like that's,
or you can not even just on the napping thing, but like I could play video games in the evenings and just completely enjoy it and not constantly be thinking about the stuff that I wasn't doing,
You mean constantly being forced to think about the things?
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's not, the thing about when I try to like describe ADHD to people, it's basically like every person has thresholds for what their brain considers something to be urgent and therefore needing you to think about, right? And for someone without ADHD, that threshold is just a bit higher, right? And so it's like you're able to put things out of your mind and be like, that's fine. I'm not going to worry about that. And you literally can just not worry about it for a while, right? But that threshold is so much lower for somebody with ADHD that your subconscious mind just keeps
popping in.
It just keeps thrusting things into the foreground even while you're doing something else. And sometimes it'll bring 3, 4, 5 things into the foreground at the same time. And so people with ADHD will often like do stuff like make lists. And like if you try to like tell them stuff that they're supposed to do verbally, at some point they'd be like, hold on, let's slow this down and like talk through this one thing at a time, because they have to kind of get things organized.
I think of it as
somewhere
my brain,
outside of their brain,
Yeah, I think of it as my brain being loud, right? And that Adderall just sort of turned the volume down a bit. It was just as like it was still the same amount of stuff. Like it was like I kind of think of it as just like a cacophony of my own voice, but telling me about different things, right? It's like the best like kind of model for it. So it's like being in a restaurant where everybody is me and they're all looking at me, but it's the noise of a restaurant,
right?
And just like telling me about all the things I should be thinking about and working on, like half-formed ideas and whatever flying around. And for me, it didn't actually like pare that back. It didn't like reduce the number of voices. It just reduced the overall volume so that the thing I wanted to direct my attention towards, I wasn't as constantly just like losing focus and falling back into the mass, right?
The metaphor that I've used to try to like describe this to people is if you've been like at a indoor public pool and you're just like chilling in the water, and you could just hear there's like just a trillion things happening, and it's all echoey, and it's like, and if you're trying to think, then it's like there's just so many things happening. But then if you just duck your head under the water, so it's like, woof, and then you're just with your thoughts now, and you can actually think. And that to me was very much like what the Ritalin felt like. It's like all of a sudden, all this noise just kind of like you can still it's there, and you can kind of hear it, but it's very muffled now, and you can just focus on your internal dialogue.
I know some people are worried about losing, because the reality is like having ADHD makes you, it is bridged with, creativity, entrepreneurism, like all sorts of stuff because of this problem. We call it a problem, but really it's
Yeah, you can't stop thinking about things, so you do, and then you have all kinds of ideas. And
Yeah,
you go do stuff.
So, but I didn't experience any like loss in that kind of creativity or whatever else. And in fact, I think because I was able to, I used to spend like 2.5 hours on Sundays planning my day, planning my week, every single Sunday, planning and reviewing and doing all this stuff. And that's what I mean when I say like I got so much time all of a sudden. It was like instead of doing that, I would actually spend like an hour and a half. Yeah. Doing some art practice.
And it's not like that was the only time you spent planning either. Like that was just the beginning.
Yeah.
You know?
every morning I would sit down.
Every day was like 30 minutes of going through stuff and trying to figure out what you're going to do that day. So
I got to I kept my systems in place, maybe more so set than you had during that kind of initial onset of stuff. But I basically pulled it back quite a bit. So like that Sunday review, I still did it, but it was fucking 10 minutes, you know, like, what am I going to do? It's like, all right. That was fucking it, as opposed to like really trying to get into it and figure out how to think up and structure it so that I wouldn't, fall off the wagon halfway through the week and all this stuff. And
a big part of it is task switching too, right? Because a lot of trying to figure out what you're going to do this week or today is you got to check in a bunch of different places, right? Like check your calendar, check your email, talk to people, look at your to-do list or whatever. And with ADHD, that task switching is just like a golden opportunity to just suddenly start doing something else. Like you'll be like, oh, let me check my calendar. And you go do that. And then suddenly you're reading a book.
Yep.
Right. And it's been 10 minutes. Like, wait, what the fuck? And then suddenly you're on YouTube. And it's, and so those planning sessions would take a long time, not necessarily because you're spending all that time rigorously thinking about your plan. It's because you're just trying to keep yourself focused on the plan,
Yeah, I would say
which the drugs help with. So
thinking about ADHD as a lifestyle is, I think, a very useful lens.
And you have to because it's literally how your brain works.
You have to, but I think it's easy to think about it as a like a piece of like just I guess a thing you're trying to manage, like a small injury or like having a cold or something like that. And it's like, no. Like this, framing it as a way of being and then figuring out how to structure your life. Almost like if you said, hey, I'm going to go be like an Olympic gold medalist, or actually with all this other stuff we're talking about, I'm going to go figure out how to be jacked in the gym, right? You suddenly have a bunch of questions about processes and how-tos that you can go interrogate to figure out how to do that better. And I think as long as you recognize that it's like it is a way of being that is required to be effective when you have ADHD, which means that like I don't take breaks from exercise. I don't because I can't.
It'll fuck you up.
I can't. Yeah. And I know it's great. Other people they can go on and off the horse and that's fine. But like mentally, I will be fucked up. So that's just a rule. I cannot take breaks for it. So
I like to believe that I can, but I know that's a lie.
Yeah. I gave up on that a while. Yeah. I was like, all right, I'll just accept this fact, let's go. And so I think that's a big part of it. It's just recognize the actual truths present and similar to Seth, you're talking about like being an artist, my sort of not wanting to own that responsibility. And so distancing yourself from it in a way.
Right. As soon as you say, I am X, then that comes with a set of standards and judgments. Requirements,
right? Like
commitments.
Yeah. And so it's like, okay, yeah, if you know you have ADHD and you are not taking steps to say like, yeah, if you know that exercise, for example, for you works really well, actually, then treating it as if it's a nice to have is wildly inappropriate. It's like oh yeah, I need to drink water every day so I don't have a fucking headache, but I don't. Why?
Yeah.
Like stop it, like.
Yeah. And of course it's not that simple, right? Because it's a matter of you have to make yourself do those things still, because one of the core features of ADHD is
just because you want to do something, you
literally not like sitting in there knowing
it's not correlated with whether you do it or not.
But I think that becomes the trick, which is figuring out how to, on those core aspects of life that are most affecting of your overall, state with ADHD, figuring out how to make those the sorts of things that have that kind of urgency or importance to you and you have the space for becomes the first task, really, but it's
also it's a lot of why ADHD can be so disabling too, right? Because
yes,
even being able to somehow make yourself do the stuff requires that you have the context to do it, right? And so I think it's one of those like that's why there's so much nuance in that discussion of like, is ADHD a disability or is it a superpower, right? And the reality is the answer is yes. It's yes. The answer is yes, yeah, because anytime the way that your brain or your body works differently from the way the world was designed, that's a disability now. Like definitionally, that's what it is, right? Because that means that the world isn't designed for you and you need an accommodation or many accommodations to
the
make
world
it
needs
work,
you to
right?
do something.
Yeah,
and
you
it's
have to now do something.
hard
Other
for
people
you
have
to
to
do.
do something to make that work, right?
Yeah.
But also because you're not average in whatever that dimension is, right? Then that also allows you to see things that other people don't, allows you to think about things in ways that they don't. It also adds these other dimensions, right? And so stuff can just be both, right? It doesn't, it's not really a one or the other, but
Yeah, I
exactly
think
how
people-
much it's either one of those. Just solely, it depends mostly on your context and like what the environment around you looks like and if it's supportive of the kind of, brain and body that you have, or if it isn't.
Yeah, and I do think there's a risk, and similarly with identifying as an artist or identifying as a person with ADHD or whatever else. I do always find it challenging when people identify very strongly with either one of the sides in particular.
Yeah, it's like a one-dimensional, like this defines who I am.
Yeah,
or whatever.
And most typically you'll see that right after you get a diagnosis. It's like because it's essentially you finding another piece of yourself and getting language to talk about it, kind of like the art thing, right? But there's a danger present in that too, which is like, Adam, to your point, that there's frankly just too much nuance about what it means to live, with this particular kind of a mind in terms of the pros and cons. And it is not a sort of thing where it's like, yeah, it's just strictly better, or yeah, it's just like terrible, under all circumstances. There are plenty of days or even weeks before I even knew what was happening, that I had felt like I was just cruising, no problems whatsoever, not for any particular reason, just like brain was just firing all cylinders and that was fine, I think you have to watch over identifying with a piece of how you are built,
Yeah,
right? Even if it's a big piece.
Yeah, and I will say that is something that I think is part of the process. So I think back to like my college days, where we grew up in Iowa, and especially at the college that I went to, there was a ton of Christian religious groups on campus.
Yes.
And I grew up, we all grew up not religious, not like anti-religious necessarily, just like we just weren't religious, right? But also we had experienced things in our family and seen things that over time, at least for me personally, did make me kind of swing into the anti-religious camp. And when I got to college, but also it wasn't something I thought a lot about. I was just like occasionally peeved about some of the things happening that I saw religious people doing to people I cared about, because of whatever. So when I got to college, it was the first time where I discovered there were a whole bunch of other non-religious people there, and we got together, and we had like a student group, and it wasn't like it was weird because we all united on something that none of us had. Mm-hmm. Right? Like normally you're like, oh, this is a group for people who like knitting, right? And then it's like, would you form a group for people who aren't into knitting? It's weird, right? Like that you would have like a group formed around a lack of something. But for so many of us at that time, it was us kind of learning about this piece of ourselves, and in so doing, we over-identified with it, and we're trying to find the lines, like trying to find the boundaries of like what makes us different from people who aren't like us. And I think in those early stages of kind of like exploring and learning more about something about yourself, you do just kind of like
100%.
Really overcommit, and you look at everything in your life through the lens of that dimension. Mm-hmm. But over time that kind of like fades into the background. Like it's just not something like nowadays. I just don't care. Like it's not something I think about. It's not something that I feel like is an important part of me, really. It's just kind of a thing. It's like a trait in the background.
Yeah, it becomes a part of the mix, right? I think it's important to let it be part of the mix and not be like completely self-defined by any one of these particular things. Whether it's
in a different context, if you were more actively oppressed by a religious context, right, then you probably have to spend more time focusing on that side to basically manage yourself in that new context.
100%.
Right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. It's in the same way, like if you're
experiences.
Yeah. If you don't have good support from like your workplace or your home life, or like what your ADHD truths are, right, then you end up having to like really just like really be thinking about it all the time, right? And like
Because you have to fight for it in a lot of
yeah,
ways.
because
Right?
you have to fight for it. And I think the thing that actually allows you to move from like a label first way of thinking about yourself or other people is actually having had accommodations around you and an acceptance around you that allows you to start, because it's not that like being an atheist doesn't have an impact anymore, right? It's that
It does mean that I probably can't run for most public offices, but I didn't want to do that
you
anyway.
didn't want to do that anyway, right?
No problem.
But it does mean that like in a more religious society, you would just be more actively oppressed is actually the outcome, right? It's just right now, like because of just this, of the current society that we live in, like it's just open enough to the idea.
Get to a safe space, basically.
Yeah, that you're actually safe, right? Like doing that, so you don't have
and
to.
a bit, I mean, something that kind of like caused me to double down were things like we would just have posters to advertise to other students on campus, like, hey, if you're not religious but you're looking for a student group, because almost all the student groups were various religious student groups. If you're just looking for some friends and also like you're not looking to join a prayer circle, come to our Sunday brunches, and those posters would get ripped down within an hour every single time, because people from the religious student groups hated the idea that there was a group of non-religious people getting together and just existing. Right.
Yeah. And that's where
that caused us to double down and draw those, those boundaries and stuff.
Yeah. Well, and also to focus more on the label itself, because it was the label that actually was the thing being attacked, right? Without any nuance and so on. Right. Yeah. So
that's over time. Nuance can creep in over time, but at the very beginning, it is very just like bold lines.
No, and it is the case. Like for me, I would say I'm probably more militantly atheistic than I ever was. Like, right. But how though has shifted a lot.
Right. What it looks like.
Yeah. In the same way that like I still have just as much ADHD as I ever did. Right. And how I like work with that though is like something that's like been rapidly evolving since discovering that was an explanation for how my brain worked, right? And so I think a lot of it is that it's not about necessarily like, because you can't let a lot of these things go, because like the fact that we basically, because even though like we have still enough societal freedom that we are allowed to be atheist, right, without being thrown in jail, right? There's still a substantial fraction of people who would love to throw us in jail, right? And are trying to pull up enough power to be able to do that someday, right? And so we don't get to just say like, oh, well, we're fine now, so like we can just ignore that.
And right now, like we're further down on the list of people who they want to throw into jail, right? Yep. And it's like people are trying to check stuff off of that list, right?
Yeah, they're trying to get.
So it's not something you can, it's not something you can just ignore and be like, this isn't a thing. This isn't a thing in our society. It is, but there are other currently more pressing things going.
Well, I mean, that's the thing is it's always about the context. Like, so you can't like. None of your traits are just traits that exist in a vacuum. They all depend on your context and whether or not. The soup. Yeah, whether or not like your ADHD is a big deal depends on your specific details of your actual just self, but at least as much depends on the environment that you're in. And so and the most important thing across the board for all of this is having people and like the structures around you, like in your nearest vicinity, being ones that are accommodating and actually can like are able to go into the nuances, right? So that you can actually figure stuff out. Because like my household, double ADHD household, right? We've had to actually have ourselves be happy and be happy together. We've had to just change how we think about like, what does it mean for the house to be tidy, right? What does it mean for it to be clean? What does it mean for us to have like chores that we have to do? Like, which are the ones that we really do have to do, right? To the point where like we have not an unclean house, but we don't have a tidy house, right? Mm-hmm. And for a long time, that was something we were always like fighting ourselves and each other kind of about. Like not real fights, right? But like we were always like
little tension.
Yeah, it's always like, oh, like could we stop putting piles of stuff over here? Could you stop doing that over there? Right? Like,
and eventually you're like, no.
Yeah, and eventually we're like, and the fact is like, that's where the nuance comes in, right? It's like we actually like we could just push ourselves harder to try to maintain a more tidy space, right?
Or do some work structurally to see if there's some way to
Yeah, exactly. There's stuff that we could do, but what we've realized is that we don't actually care, right? There's like the threshold where we are.
If you did, it would have already been taken care of, you know?
Yeah, well, it's a difference of like kinds of households, right? Like once we stop buying into the idea that like your house had to look like somebody walked in and took a picture for a magazine, right? And that it can look like a lived-in space. You know, like it can look like somebody was just in the middle of something and stopped because that's literally what happened, right? It doesn't have to be cleaned up instantly and that kind of stuff. Then once we started to basically kind of accept that, and especially once we learned that we both have ADHD and now had like an explanation for things, that didn't mean that, because we could have gone to the extreme and said, okay, nobody has to clean up anything ever.
Now we're slobs.
It's just we're slobs and we're living in a fucking pile of garbage, right? But
that's the source of drives me absolutely.
Yeah, that's where the nuance comes in, right? Is there's this inherent unfairness with having the world not designed in a way that takes into account who you are personally, right? And it's one of those like, boomer jokes, or not jokes, but just the world is unfair, right? Just get used to it kind of a thing, right? But the nuance there is
it's always a person who is directly doing something to make it unfair.
Oh, yeah,
who
absolutely.
says
Yes, it always is. But that idea of like, and that's the thing of like coming to terms to accept is like, at what point do you just accept that this is now it just is unfair, but I still have to do X, right?
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily absolve you of responsibility to note that something is unfair.
Right. And it's finding the balance because it is unfair and you shouldn't have to, like when.
Sure.
Right. And that's all true, but you might still have to, and trying to figure out where things are. I think that's the challenge, and that's how you try to find that nuanced point, but also that's the part that takes into account the reality that you're surrounded by.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. So thank you guys very much for the questions. And again, keep those questions coming. We're going to try to do a better job of just focusing on those, especially at this particular time in development where things are progressing rapidly, but we're going to keep things quiet about Crash Sites 2 stuff. So, thank you very much. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, you can just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week.
Goodbye.